My lecture this evening is about lost aspects of church decoration from the medieval period, the curtains, veils and floor coverings that once played a vital part both in the visual spectacle of the ecclesiastical interior and in the liturgy that took place around them. Due to the fragile medium in which they were made, little survives of these original objects apart from visual records and manuscripts from many different sources and periods that use contemporary church interiors as models for the illustrations they contained. For example, this illustration from the Ashburnham Pentateuch arguably models its Old Testament interiors on contemporary 7th century Roman churches, filled with curtains hung around the space to divide the architectural bays and chapels inside. Or this illustration of the message to the church of Smyrna from the 10th century Beatus manuscript in Girona Cathedral. And this exalted roll from early 12th century Fondi, where cloth hangings are depicted tied up along the nave of the church. Likewise, the ghosts of the textile hangings that were used in palace interiors as part of ceremonial ritual can be seen in the many regal images and in numbers of gospel books from an equally wide range of sources, such as this well-known mosaic of the Theodoric Palace in Santa Pollinare in Ravenna, or this 10th century image of Otto II enthroned from Rensselaer Abbey. Texts and inventories also recount the rich textile interiors of medieval churches, and references to them again cover great spans of time and geographical locations. I will return to these texts in more detail later, but, for example, in the 4th century account of her travels to Jerusalem, Adria recalls the silken hangings in the churches there as part of the complete spectacle of the church interior. On the Feast of the Holy Apostles in 1143, Philagthos of Kermeos describes the rich textiles that adorn the newly consecrated Palatine Chapel in Norman Palermo, describing how a great many curtains are hung, the fabric of which is threads of silk woven with gold and various dyes that the Phoenicians have embroidered with wonderful skill and elaborate artistry. More overlooked are the fictive textiles that were incorporated into the painted and sculptural decoration of church interiors throughout the medieval period, and which are the subject of this lecture. Studying a series of examples of this form of decoration from southern Italy provides a way of evaluating the historical precedents for this imitative art form, as well as how the fictive hangings were incorporated into ecclesiastical decoration alongside real cloths. The more symbolic meaning of the fictive textiles is also important and ties into liturgical ritual and the particular qualities of precious textiles and the role that they played in the medieval church. The focus of my lecture will be examples of this form that survive in church interiors and museum collections in southern Italy, but I will incorporate and reference examples that illustrate how this practice can be seen in wider geographical contexts, particularly in Romanesque church interiors across Western Europe. A number of relief sculptures survive in southern Italy, part of a corpus of early medieval sculpture that has been dated to the 10th and 11th century. These include 2 marble panels that form the sanctuary screen at the Chapel of Sant'Espreno a Porto, now incorporated into the Palazzo Borsa in Naples. Related panels and panel fragments also survive in the Cathedral Church and Museo Coreale in Sorrento, Dumbarton Oaks, and the Museo Barocco in Rome. These arranged with a similar lattice design, and these with roundel or medallion designs. From their style and the subject matter, the formal structured designs and the symmetrical arrangement of the animal and floral motifs, the majority of any scholarship that has focused on these panels in the past has commented on them as textile-based sculptures, copied or heavily influenced by decorated textiles, or reproducing the motifs of imported textiles. These textiles were seen as being part of the major trade carried out by southern Italian merchants from the trading centres of the Campanian coast, Amalfi in particular. Further examples of painted textiles survive that are also important for the subject matter of this lecture, including that in the apse of Santa Maria in Foro Claudio and Venturoli in the Campagna, which imitates a woven elephant silk, and has been dated to the same period as the fresco cycles within the church, to the mid-11th century. Also related to this is the fictive textile in the apse of Santa Maria in Palara, Rome, that was added to an earlier painted scheme within the church under the patronage of the Abbey of Monte Cassino and the Abbacy of Desiderius in the mid-11th century. And that's a close-up of the painted textile. The situation of these churches and their connection through contacts or proximity to Amalfi and its merchants has been a major factor in the discussion of or connection between these art forms and textiles. Previous comments on the textile-like nature of the sculptures in particular, and published in the early to mid-20th century, were more concerned with labelling the origins of the motifs used, principally to the Sasanian Middle East and other Islamic sources of manufacture transmitted through textile designs. However, it is important to evaluate extant textile evidence in order to properly link these designs to the original fabrics that were circulating in the early medieval Mediterranean. The relationship between the Sorrento panels and the painted apse fresco designs from Venturoli and Rome in a particular type of with a particular type of textile design known as the medallion or roundel pattern is quite clear. These silks were being produced from both Byzantine workshops and those from the Middle East, possibly in Syria and Tunisia, and numerous fragments of these textiles survive. For example, this griffin silk from Sitten, Germany, the Ganymede silk in the Abegg Stiffing collection in Rigsberg, a Pegasus silk that survives as part of the lining of the Mandylion reliquary in Genoa, and a silk from the Cooper Hewitt Museum in New York, and the famous elephant silk from Aachen Cathedral Treasury. Whilst the specific source of the production of these silks is often debated, they have all been dated to the early medieval period and follow a tradition of medallion patterns used as textile designs that goes back further into the antique period. Details such as the ribbon bands seen on both the sculptural panel and the silk motifs are details that were inherited from Sasanian art, the ribbon indicating that the often powerful mythic beasts depicted belonged to the Sasanian royal menagerie. The structure of the lattice design is also one that can be found in textile design stretching from the antique to the medieval periods. For example, this silk fabric from the treasury at Sens Cathedral, probably a late antique example, uses a formal lattice design in order to create diamond frames for the individual motifs. In this case, adores birds. Or this fragment of an Egyptian silk, probably from the early medieval period, that uses an interwoven lattice to create a loosely knitted textile design. I will not go into the details about the development of both these types of weaving designs here, but it is likely that they might have originated in different geographical areas of the Mediterranean, perhaps imported from textile workshops further east into the Asian continent. For the purpose of this lecture, fragments and large hangings in both silk, linen and wool survive to support a supposition that the sculptural panels in Naples and Sorrento were heavily based on the layout of woven textile. The designs that capture the spirit of the motifs and the structure of the Naples and Sorrento lattice reliefs are most closely linked to a group of woven curtain designs from Egypt. For example, the structure and overall aesthetic appearance of a pair of curtains in the British Museum is evocative of the design of the Santa Sprena panels, particularly the lattice structure and the variation of figural and vegetal motifs that are distributed across the surface. Motifs found on the panels, particularly of hunting or running animals, are also found on a 6th century pair of curtains at the Royal Ontario Museum in Canada. The arrangement of the chase found on these curtains creates a spatially similar effect to the beasts that decorate the surface of the marble panels, arranged in diagonal tiers across the surface, creating a diamond-shaped pattern, which, on the Santa Sprena panels, is formalized by a lattice grid. Details of prey turning their heads to glance at the pursuant predators are also reflected in the sculptural reliefs. And the woven curtains also use a mixture of dogs and deer, while other fragments include mythical griffins and leopards in the hunt. These examples have been dated quite early to the 6th century and the late antique rather than the early medieval. However, dating these textiles even through carbon dating is difficult, and a relative consistency in the decorative motifs and arrangements can be seen in textile designs over a long period of time. Similar patterns and arrangements can be seen in textiles that span hundreds of years. In this sense, the curtains provide an excellent sense of the types of object that formed a model or the inspiration for the reliefs from Santo Espino and Sorrento Cathedral. Each of the textile fragments shown here were objects of import and mercantile exchange. They also represent the most sophisticated textile products available on the medieval market, composed of richly coloured luxury fibres that were then woven together to create intricately detailed patterns over the surface of the cloth. The status of these objects and the cost involved in producing them was high. However, the accessibility to these objects in southern Italy was made possible through the activities of southern Italian merchants, particularly those from Amalfi, whose entrepreneurial nature and wide-ranging trading contacts is well documented in the early medieval period. For example, correspondence from Pope John VIII, 872 to 882, from the late 9th century, references mercantile activity between the Campania and North Africa. During John VIII's campaign to expel Muslim settlers from papal territories and protect these lands from pirate raiders, the Pope tried to persuade Naples and Amalfi to relinquish their ties with Muslim traders in order to assist him in the protection of this land. He did so through the offer of fiscal appeasement and eventually the threat of anathematization. However, the repeated appeals to these cities to sequester papal demands suggest that, despite such great threats, no successful agreement was reached. Unlike the merchant city of Gaeta, which accepted papal lands in return for assisting in the expulsion of Muslim settlements and pirate raiders, assisting the papacy meant sacrificing the alliances and trading rights that must have provided such a major source of Amalfi's wealth. The rewards reaped from good trading relations appear to have prevented the city from giving in to Pope John's demands and relinquishing such precious privileges in the Muslim Mediterranean. Amalfi's commitment to the profits of trade, illustrated in these records, suggests that the city's trading networks had been sufficiently well established, that relinquishing them would have caused greater damage to the prosperity of the city than accepting the financial benefits offered by the Pope. Without a stable and financially rewarding trading relationship with these Muslim territories, there may have been less of an incentive to defy the papacy and its offer of increased land and money. Further evidence of strong trading connections and mercantile activity is also illustrated by a warning message that was carried from Tunis by the Amalfitan merchant Floro in about 870, in order to inform the Duke of Salerno about an impending attack on the town by Muslim raiders. A century later, Christian and probably Amalfitan merchants are recorded providing naval assistance to the Fatimids during their conquest of Egypt in 969. And it is likely that fiscal incentives and trading privileges might have been part of the negotiations involved. The presence of Amalfitan merchants is further attested to in Old Cairo in 996, where sources describe a bloody massacre suffered by the merchant community there. In his near-contemporary account of the event, Yahya of Antioch specifically refers to the Rum Malafita, suggesting that significant numbers of the Amalfitan trading community must have been slaughtered for the chronicler to mention Malafita specifically. Rum in these sources was derived from the word used to describe a Roman or Christian, and at this point in history it was generally used to refer to Europeans, in this case Europeans from Malfi or Amalfi. Evidence that the cargo carried by these merchants included luxury textiles also exists in a number of historical sources from the early medieval period. One of these is the short account by the Umayyad historian Ibn Hayyan, who described the activities of Amalfitan merchants in Cordoba in 942. The merchants arrived in the city selling purple satin and other precious goods. It is interesting and important that the purple silk is separately and specifically mentioned apart from other precious merchandise, which would have likely included spices and incense. The court of the Caliph at Cordoba at this particular time would have been a commercially profitable place for the sale of such goods. The building of the palace complex of the Madinat al-Zahra during the first half of the 10th century, aristocratic life and courtly rituals required materials and resources that could not be found or provided in sufficient quantities from the Iberian Peninsula. Whilst this primarily concerned building materials, such as the marble required for the construction of the palace, it would have also been the case for the precious goods that the Amalfitan merchants are reported as carrying, which might have included bases for perfumes, ambergris, musk, or camphor, the demand for which at the court would have been high. The purple satin that the Amalfitan merchants are described as carrying would have been in high demand. Whilst it is thought that some silks were woven in northern Spain and the royal tiras had been founded at the Umayyad court in Cordoba during the reign of Al-Rahman II, the presence of southern Italian merchants selling silk textiles also suggests that there was a market for silks, either of particular colour or style, from other manufacturing centres of the Mediterranean, such as Tunis, Byzantium, Syria and Egypt. It also indicates that the key role of Italian merchants in the circulation of luxury textiles around the Mediterranean during this period. Further evidence of Amalfi's involvement in the luxury textile market is illustrated in the writings of Liutprand, Bishop of Cremona, 920 to 972, in his Relatio de Legatione Constantinopolitana. In this text, Liutprand records the presence of Amalfitan merchants in the mid-10th century in Constantinople during one of his 2 diplomatic missions to the Byzantine court. Constantinople was also the major trade centre of the Byzantine Eastern Mediterranean. It's also suggested that in this text that these Amalfitan merchants were involved in the sale and acquisition of silk textiles. In this instance, the contraband and strictly controlled imperial purple silks that represented the highest quality textiles being produced in the Byzantine Empire. The Bishop of Cremona embarked upon a diplomatic mission to Constantinople in 968 on behalf of the Holy Roman Emperor Otto I. Towards the end of this visit, Liutprand recounted being charged with buying a quality of silk described by officials as prohibited goods, which, although not specifically named, can be interpreted as the highest status purple woven silks of the Byzantine court. Later he comments that they included 5 of the most valuable purple garments. In this instance, Liutprand maintained that the contraband fabrics had been bought from Italian merchants, specifically from Venetian and Amalfitan merchants who, by bringing them to us, support themselves on the provisions we give them. Liutprand also refers to purchasing these silks to do honour to my church, perhaps for use as vestments or silken hangings. A further source provides evidence of the availability and importance of these expensive silks in the markets of Amalfi, specifically for purchase as gifts of the highest expense or as donations to the church treasuries. Leo of Ostia's Chronicle of Monte Cassino includes a description of a journey by its abbot Desiderius to the city of Amalfi in 1065 to purchase purple silks that were intended as a gift for the visiting Emperor Henry IV. The abbot travelled from Monte Cassino to Amalfi in order to purchase 20 pieces of silk cloth called treblatos. The word treblatos here indicates a purple cloth, which is further identified as being made of silk in Leo of Ostia's account. Finally, the image of Amalfi as a city from which the wealth of the Mediterranean springs is referred to in William of Apulia's La Geste de Robert Guiscard, written between 1096 and 1099. He describes the city after its capture by the Norman leader Robert Guiscard in 1076 to 77 as a wealthy city seemingly filled with people. None is richer in silver and gold and textiles from all sorts of different places. Many sailors live in this city who are skilled in the ways of the sea and the heavens, and many different things are brought here from the royal city of Alexandria and from Antioch. Its people cross many seas. They know the Arabs, the Libyans, the Sicilians and Africans. This people is famed throughout almost the whole world as they export their merchandise and love to carry back what they have bought. It is not my purpose to dig too deeply into the nuances of these sources. Suffice to provide a background that effectively illustrates the types of textiles and the sources that might have transported them to the area of the Italian peninsula where the textile-like art forms were being created. The models for the sculpture and painted textiles are clear, as are the routes by which the objects reached the area. What is of interest in this process and function? What is of interest is the process and function of the painted and sculpted textile art form and its purpose in the early medieval church interior. A tradition of painted fictive textiles or vela appears in both Eastern and Western churches during the medieval period. Roman churches in particular demonstrate the popularity of using painted vela to decorate the lower wall areas in churches in the centuries preceding the study. Italian examples can be seen in fragments in churches, particularly in crypts such as at San Clemente and Santa Maria Antiqua. Other examples also survive from Byzantine churches or in territories attached to the Byzantine Empire, such as this example from the Ossuary Chapel at Bachkovo in Bulgaria. It is likely that this practice of decorating the lower area of the church might have stemmed from more antique models. For the most part, however, these vela differ artistically from the close formal relationship that exists between the Santo Spreno panel and Sorrento sculpture and the Venturoli elephant fresco, where decoration appears to more faithfully copy textile designs, albeit in a new form of media. The vela paintings are more concerned with the depiction of fictive curtains and recreate folds, rails and hooks to create the full illusory effect of a hung cloth. The small designs and devices used to decorate them do relate to actual textile designs. For example, these simple leaf designs on medieval silks. However, the motifs that appear on the fictive vela are not applied in a realistic manner. They are superimposed over the trompe-l'oeil fabric folds and lack the sophisticated arrangement of the designs that appear on actual surviving textiles, or the complex design of the later fresco and sculptural reliefs. In the early vela tradition, it is the bunched-up folded properties of the cloth that appear to be of greater priority than the faithful or semi-faithful recreation of the actual design. Their primary concern is the verisimilitude of the appearance of the textile as a material object, rather than its richly decorated pattern. It is possible that the greater concern for creating the aesthetic appearance of these high-status textiles over painting the fictive draperies of the hung cloth stems from a change or growth in the availability of the distinctively designed medallion silks and the numbers that were being circulated in the Mediterranean marketplaces in the early medieval period. I believe that this is evident from descriptions of textile donations that appear in medieval church inventories, where it seems the decorative motifs found on these high-status woven textiles began to be used as a descriptive element and possibly as a way of immediately indicating the quality and preciousness of the gifted cloth. The majority of the evidence that I have so far for this comes from the lists of papal donations recorded in the Liber Pontificalis. One of the most evocative passages in these lives comes from Gregory IV, 828 to 844, where the motifs of the textiles gifted to the church are heavily used amongst more traditional terminology that points to the precious metals incorporated into their decoration, or the colour indicative of expensive dyes used. This passage reads, "The holy prelate presented a dyed purple cloth with griffins and unicorns. In the same church, this venerable pope presented a cloth with griffins and gold studding around it, with the birth of our Lord Jesus Christ in the middle. The same pontiff presented another cloth with lions, with the Lord's resurrection in gold studding. 8 small gold interwoven cloths were placed on the altars reckoned to be around this church. 4 white silk veils, one with Tyrian on all sides, and a cross with gold-studded chevrons in the middle, one of cross-adorned silk. 4 veils of Rhodian, which surround the holy altar, one of which has a gold-studded cross. 26 gold interwoven veils, and also linen ones which hang in the church's great arches. Alexandrian veils hanging before the great doors, with men and horses. 1 Alexandrian curtain, 4 other veils with gold interwoven swords, 2 veil of 8-fold weave, 8 other gold interwoven veils with a purple fringe around, and 6 other veils with eagles with a fringe of Tyrian. Other Alexandrian veils, one of them with wheels and roses in the middle, the other with trees and wheels, hanging before the doors of this church. A small veil dyed purple with a man and a horse in the middle. 14 Spanish veils with silver. There too 10 small veils of dyed purple, each of them with ducks. Many of these descriptive terms are used in the inventory lists from the preceding centuries, such as dye colour or decoration with precious gems and metal, such as one of the purest gold and gems, another of pure silk decorated with a purple border, commissioned by Hadrian I, 772-95, whilst others are frequently described as being decorated with figural scenes such as the crucifixion or motifs like crosses and roses. What is interesting in the later inventory lists is a shift in the way that the textiles are described, with increasing references to zoomorphic decoration, as seen in this passage. Here are included 2 decorated with griffins, 1 with unicorns, 1 with lions, 6 with eagles, 10 with ducks, and an unspecified number, but possibly amounting to 3, with a horse and rider, probably a hunter. Textiles decorated with animal motifs are found rarely in the earlier papal biographies, the first appearing with Leo III at the end of the 8th century. In this case, 2 silks depicting elephants and another with griffins are recorded amongst his donations to the Roman churches. The life of Pascal I, 817-24, records the donation of a purple silk decorated with peacocks. What is interesting in these descriptions is the increasing number of textiles from the 9th century that are often described as decorated with a wide range of birds and animals, such as winged horses, peacock riders, lions, elephants, griffins, and unicorns, motifs that clearly relate to the popular imagery found on surviving examples of woven silks manufactured across the Mediterranean. I do not have time to go into great detail about the terminology used in this or other medieval inventories, which, in conjunction with an analysis of textile production and trade in the medieval period, is very interesting. There are also other examples of the specific mention of zoomorphic motifs on silk textile donations too. Leo of Ostia's Chronicle of Monte Cassino also includes a description of objects donated to the monastery in 1071 by the Holy Roman Emperor Henry III's wife, Empress Agnes. He is specific in his descriptions of a number of textiles, including 2 purple copes adorned with precious gold borders and a large pallium with elephants, which they call a dossal. Interest in a more faithful copying of textile designs in church decoration in the early medieval period may well be linked to the increasing use of the aesthetic imagery of real luxury textiles donated to church interiors. Even within the Church of Santa Maria Antiqua, there is evidence for a change in approach to the depiction of fictive vela in some of the later fresco decoration. Now much faded, Joseph Wilpert's early 20th century photographs show a painted velum around the apse of the church that combines the loops and folds of the earlier trompe-l'oeil vela, but combined with a much more faithful depiction of the decoration of a medallion design decorated with cross motifs. The fresco dates from the earlier 8th century and the pontificate of Paul I. Models for the design are also evident in surviving textile fragments. It is not dissimilar from this Egyptian tapestry fragment from the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, or a Tiraz silk design from the Viennese collection. Additionally, other examples of painted textiles that apply a similar artistic approach, that of the flat repetition of a zoomorphic design, can be found in locations in other parts of Europe, such as this example from a chapel in the crypt of Chartres Cathedral. The status of the woven textiles that were being recorded in inventories and art forms was not something confined to Western Europe either. Roundel silks can be seen in Byzantine and the art of the Eastern Mediterranean in more conventional formats used as clothing or seating for monarchs and princes, such as the elephant silk in this image of the Armenian ruler Gagabar of Kars and his family from his 10th century gospel book. You can just see the elephants on this image. Or this royal Armenian portrait of Gagik Atzruni I depicted in a sculptural relief on the facade of the Church of the Holy Cross at Akhtamar. Or this 11th century portrait of Emperor Nicephorus Botaniakis and his courtiers in the homilies of John Chrysostom. Amongst the different high-status silks used for the robing, one courtier is dressed in a silk with a design of beasts and roundels that is similar to the textiles discussed here. That's the second one in from the left. It seems likely that it is the strong motif designs and their links to the finest quality woven textiles available that were key in prompting a more literal transcription of the cloth objects into painted stone reliefs. The question, however, remains as to why these fictive textiles were being created and what purpose they served. Why deliberately evoke a costly woven silk in paint in such a way as to recreate its visual appearance rather than the illusion or trompe-l'oeil effect of a hanging fabric? Practically, painted and stone carved textiles also provide solutions for the decoration of ecclesiastical spaces, where movable curtains and hangings are not physically suitable. In painting, frescoes can provide the illusion of hangings, preserving those actual textiles for spaces between walls, where they are required, such as doorways between the nave and the aisles, or transepts. Many of the places where the earlier images from manuscripts had them bunched up, as well as spaces where barriers had to be created, such as the entrance to the sanctuary, which would need to be visible and hidden at different points in the liturgical calendar. Likewise, the lower part of the sanctuary screen would require a fixed and immovable barrier, qualities that a textile could not provide. Liturgical furniture, ambos and pulpits would need to be made from stone or wood. I drew briefly on the actual lost textiles from these interiors in my introduction, but their importance in the medieval church interior looked back to the Old Testament and the descriptions of the tabernacle and temple used to house the Holy of Holies. This, in its incarnation in the desert, was a tent hung with richly dyed cloth, decorated with golden images of cherubs, which is described as made with 10 sheets of fine twilled linen of purple stuffs, violet shade and red, and of crimson stuffs, finely brocaded with cherubs. Liturgical commentators such as William of Durandus and Johann Berliff, a 12th century liturgist, emphasize the exegetical connections between the Holy of Holies and the church sanctuary space through the use and action of the textile element of the church interior. Berliff describes the veiling and unveiling of the sanctuary with curtains and textiles on Sunday and at Easter, where 2 veils will be kept, one of which is put all around the choir so that the things that are in the Holy of Holies are not manifest. Indeed, though this is meant how the knowledge of divine scripture was not yet released to the mind of the unfaithful, those 2 veils are folded up on Sundays, and those days relate to the time of Easter. So also, especially at night, the 4th day before Easter, when it is dealt with the death of the Lord, everything is completely renewed, because when he died, the veil of the temple was torn, so that those things that were hidden inside the Holy of Holies were, for the first time, were revealed to everybody. Decorating the liturgical space, the curtains act as visual parallels to the revelation of the mysteries of the Mass and its replacement of the temple veil at the heart of the Church's sacred space through the death and resurrection of Christ. Behind a real altar, however, an actual hanging could be replaced by a fictive curtain where painted copies can provide a visually coherent link to the real textiles hanging further forward. This would be particularly effective when the altar is visible and the real curtains opened and tied to reveal the sanctuary space and the fictive textiles behind it. Thus, the use of paint as a medium to create textiles around important spaces in the church interior could be very effective. The painted textile, whilst lacking the tactile qualities of a real cloth, could visually unify the space around the altar or between the walls of the church by reflecting the decorative appearance of textiles used in that same space. Sculpture could be equally effective in this sense, marble panels providing a fixed barrier between nave and sanctuary, with real curtains hung above to control the visibility of that space. Equally, monumental furniture decorated with panels, such as those that survive at Sorrento, would visually fit with a decorative environment where woven textiles carrying similar motifs were hung between the aisles. Practically, therefore, the decoration of fixed elements of ecclesiastical space could mirror and reflect the decoration of textiles and hangings, creating a unified visual environment. That was also suitable for the different functions and needs of the church interior. Where the original textiles have since perished, these painted and stone-carved objects offer echoes of the longevity and importance of the use of real textiles in church interiors. The issue of practicality does not, however, explain what appears to be a development away from the use of a more traditional form of veiler in the 10th and 11th centuries, in creating fictive cloths that are more concerned with the recreation of the aesthetic appearance of expensive luxury imported fabrics from across the Mediterranean. Neither does it fully explain the recreation of these motifs in liturgical furnishings, which, although they might have been surrounded by textiles, had a function and use that was far removed from the requirements of textile form. These examples of painted and sculptural textiles appear to reject the practice of the illusory nature of a trompe-l'oeil hanging in their deliberate evocation of designs laid flat rather than concentrating on fictively reimagining the material qualities of the textile and paint. These conclusions suggest that textiles in the early medieval church interiors carried unique qualities that, it seems, allowed fictive textiles to act symbolically within the church interior, functioning in a similar way to the real textiles, but in a new form. It seems the textile could be fully transformed throughout media in paint and stone, but retain or transfer part of its character in the new medium within which they were represented. In part, this seems to have been possible through the strong visual aesthetic carried by the finest imported textiles available in the Mediterranean, whereby the recognizable design of a painted cloth immediately indicated the status of the original it copied, and therefore transferred this status onto the copied version, mirroring in the church interior the precious textiles housed in the treasury. These real textiles were as precious as the gold, silver, and gems housed in the same treasuries, reflecting the church as a mirror of the heavenly city of Jerusalem and used to adorn and wrap sacred relics. In essence, it seems the textile copy carried with it that association of preciousness despite its translation into a different medium. And through the reproduction of its ornamentation, the original material object status was retained. The ability of textiles to retain a copy is made clear by the oldest relics associated with Christ, the mandilion, the Saint Veronica, and the shroud, and in each example it is the textile that absorbs the image of Christ, which is then transferred onto the cloth, and in the case of the Mendelian, further transferred into a third medium, that of a brick tile. In their transference of sacredness, textiles work like icons and the architectural copies of important sites by retaining the direct relationship to the sacred through the copy. I would describe this as the transitive nature of textile decoration, and the woven designs of textiles discussed here became intimately linked with the associations of preciousness that were attached to these high-status objects. Whether they are real textiles or fictive versions, these associations are vital in understanding the translation of these motifs and designs into wall painting and sculpture for ecclesiastical spaces. The same principle can be understood from the painted textile pages of illuminated manuscript. One of the most overt examples of this association between a textile and its painted imitation is the marriage charter of Otto II and the Byzantine princess Theophanum. The charter, dated 972, is a long parchment that imitates a richly decorated silk adorned with birds and beasts in medallion frames over a deep purple background. Over this dense and beautiful background, the official charter is written in golden Greek script. The use of the dye, cochineal and indigo, and a localized use of decorative motifs within the roundels make it clear that this is not a slavish copy of a silk textile. However, the intention of the decoration of the parchment is a direct visual association with a precious silk, over which the dynastic union between the Byzantine princess and the Holy Roman Emperor is written. The visual and political art histories that surround this work are complicated, and it is not my purpose to discuss them here, other than to suggest that the decoration through these visual associations carries as much of the regal and precious meaning as the text that was written over it. Within a church or cathedral interior, the interpretation of the visual associations of fictive textiles would be different from those that could be read from a political document like the marriage charter. Yet the visual significance of these hangings is equally important. My earlier discussion of Old Testament prototypes and the theological associations of veils and curtains around the sanctuary and altar outlined their historical significance as well as the theological links between the temple veil and the resurrection. Their role as curtains in revealing and hiding space and directing vision within the liturgies of the church calendar, all of which were equally essential. In this context, luxurious woven fabrics, particularly coloured silks decorated with birds and beasts, were suitable fabrics because of their symbolic associations with preciousness, created through the same expense and rarity that gave them such political importance. It is these qualities that also made them suitable clothing for wrapping sacred relics. The Genoa mandilia I mentioned earlier, the cloth is further, the Mendelian cloth is further wrapped in its case by the lining, which is composed of a fragment of golden yellow silk, decorated with inhabited roundels that frame winged quadruped beasts. As the relics are shrouded by silk, so the church interior is dressed with this regal clothing to further augment the sacred nature of the space. This translation of the qualities of a real textile into a fictive textile in this religious context can also be seen in the textile pages that are found in 10th and 11th century Ottonian manuscripts, which retain the precious qualities of luxury textiles, despite being reproduced in a different medium. In manuscripts such as the Luxeuil Gospels, woven silks are literally recreated in parchment form in a similar manner to the decoration of the marriage charter of Otto II, but here used in a religious text. By visually recreating lengths of silk, the paintings allow the pages themselves to act as silken veils, revealing and protecting the religious texts and images that follow, in the same way that the real silk fragments that line the front and back covers of the Linder Gospels and the Pierpont Morgan Library in New York cover the first and final pages of the manuscript. Thus, it is the visual qualities of these objects, transferred through their aesthetic motifs, designs, and coloured dyes, that create powerful associations of status and preciousness. These visual associations transcend political or ecclesiastical use and allow the textiles to perform similar functions, whether they are used to dress a prince or veil a sanctuary space. Textiles translated into different medium in ecclesiastical contexts retain these qualities, despite being reproduced in frescoes, sculpture, or manuscript. The painted silks on the apses in Venturoli in Rome and the marble panels in Naples and Sorrento also retain the visual significance of the actual textiles and real curtains that would have been used to decorate ecclesiastical interiors. They dress the sanctuary in a similar way to the silks that clothe relics, and they visually impart the sanctity of the holiest and most important parts of the church interior. In examining these sculptural and painted art forms from Romanesque and early medieval churches, the role of textiles can be seen as key, both in considering the importance of the thriving trade and merchant networks from this area of southern Italy and across the Mediterranean, and in their importance as hangings, curtains, and coverings within ecclesiastical space. Whilst a textile copy or fictive cloth cannot have the same practical use as a real textile, translating the designs and motifs found on woven textiles to decorate different media allows for the visual associations between the textile and its copy to be retained. In this way, images that promote ideas of status, preciousness, expense, and regality, all the connotations attached to imported woven objects, could be used to decorate the lower levels of the church space, linking monumental sculpture, screens, and furniture within a visual environment that promoted the importance and sacredness of that space. This imagery could work on multiple levels, but essentially shared the same symbolic role as the form of a copy, as the original cloth. A painted or stone textile around the lower walls of the nave or the apse was a far more effective way of visually wrapping the building or the sanctuary space, rather than affixing the large quantities of textiles that would have been needed for practical purposes in the nave and above the sanctuary screen. The motifs of mythical beasts, hunters, and birds of prey act as symbols of strength and protection. They also work in harmony together with both visually and theologically in the ecclesiastical environment, providing the physical barriers and veils that visually directed the sight and senses of the clergy and laity towards the holy and veiled spaces of the church and the mysteries that they contained. As surviving examples of permanent textiles, these frescoes and marble panels form decorative and functional roles within the church interior that leave fragmentary reminders of the beautiful and colourful woven cloth that would have formed a vital part of this visual environment. They are also evidence of the unique ways in which the artistic exchange of imported objects from across cultures could be reused and reinterpreted in order to reflect the specific contexts in which they were used. Thank you very much.